I'm going to talk to you about 3 different tools that we use in design. How many of you guys are familiar with wireframes? How many of you have built wireframes? Okay. How many of you have built prototypes? Okay, good number of people. And how many of you do visual design work? Okay, cool. All right, so we're going to go pretty quick. So a lot of you know what this is, a wireframe. You probably heard it described as a schematic. Sometimes people think they can make you believe they invented it themselves and they call it a blueprint. But it's basically a depiction of a screen, but it's focusing on elements, layout, navigation, content, that kind of thing. So at this point, we're not focusing on design. Information being displayed, what kinds of things you can actually do with the page. And the layout is important in terms of where things are relative to others. So going back to our principles, putting like things together and that sort of thing. And the rules for displaying certain kinds of information. And even a lot of times in our wireframes, we will show different states, like, okay, here's the happy path, here's an error state, here's what happens if you click this, here's what happens if you click that. So this is a wireframe, and what I'm going to show you is wireframe, visual design, and prototype from the same project, so you can start to see some continuity. So this is a wireframe that I did for a client that we're currently working with, and it probably looks pretty simple or similar to Kayak. It's based on the same principle of a search results page that shows you a number of results, and just like the hotels, I've got individual listings. I'm treating each one the same. I've got the same elements of information, and then on the left I can sort and filter my different results, and I can search again if I don't like what I got. So a number of ways to manipulate the page, and I don't have multiple scenarios here of what happens if you get no results and all that sort of thing, but in a typical wireframe, that's what a wireframe deck, you would have all those examples. And some of you may have used some of these tools, and I have them hyperlinked because I was going to go to them and explore them, but I won't do that today since we're limited on time. Balsamiq, any of you familiar with Balsamiq? Use Balsamiq? Okay. It's a great, cheap tool if you want to do early mock-ups, and we were talking earlier about things looking too finished. Balsamiq has a sketchy quality, so you're not going to, don't worry that people think you've got it finished, because it won't look that way. It's very easy to manipulate. You can create hotspots. You can even make it into a prototype. It's a really nice tool. We tend to use OmniGraffle a lot for Mac because you can get pretty high fidelity with it. You can do a lot of things with it. And there's a particular stencil that I really like from a gentleman who calls himself Kuniji. So you can look that up. And if you're on a PC, you can basically get the same effect with Visio. And Microsoft puts out a really nice wireframe stencil. And then if you just want to play around, you don't want to even spend, I think Balsamiq's $70. If you don't want to spend that much, you can get iMockups, which I think is $9.99 on the iPad. And you can just sit on the car on an airplane and make a quick mock-up. It's really simple, works really well. And it's not just for mobile mock-ups. You can do any kind of mock-up, but you do it on your phone.
What's your favorite tool for mock-ups when you need interactivity? I think, static screens are becoming less and less useful, in my opinion. You need the interactivity and then the touching and go between screens and back and forth.
Yes. So I'll give you my personal answer, then I'll give you the right answer. Personally, I am so fast in OmniGraffle that I still like to do quick static iterations, and I can link them together in OmniGraffle. You can create hotspots, you can create states, and of course you end up with a lot of pages, but you can create that same feel. But what typically within our company that we use a lot is Axure.
Yeah, I've used that.
Yeah. For me personally, I still am on the learning curve. And so if I just want to get something done quickly, I go to OmniGraffle because that's my go-to. But we'll talk a little bit about Axure here in just a sec. So I'm going to sort of switch gears a little bit and talk about mock-ups. And I'm calling them mock-ups here, but a lot of people call them comps or visual designs or UI designs. They depict the actual visual elements of the page, such as font, color, border, stylistic elements, shadows. Everyone's getting away from that now, but that kind of thing. And that's, I know what Kevin does and probably what you do, Empress. You guys are working in high fidelity, basically. Am I right? Or do you work in both?
Well, we usually start, we start on the whiteboard and then we'll end up in a perfect world, end up in Axure, and then fonts and stuff come later.
Right.
When It's according to whatever our product standards are, is where that comes
Right, right, to your brand standards.
in.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is that same wireframe. One of our visual designers took it and made a comp of it. And so you can kind of see, if you look at my wire, and then you look at her comp, she made some changes, and that's okay, because we're iterating. A lot of it looks the same. She gave each result a lot more room. She made their picture bigger. She's added a button, because we got some feedback from the client that we want a different button there. Even the spacing and everything on this filtering on the left side, she's given a lot more breathing room. She's just added a lot of stylistic improvements to it. I mean, obviously, you're going to prefer this to that. I do anyway, even though I did this one and she did the other one. Okay. So, a warning, because I think we can all be guilty of this. I think it's best to leave the visual design to someone who is trained in that craft, to someone who really knows what they're doing. It's easy to do this badly. And so I think it's really good to leave that to someone who knows what they're doing and can really make it look stellar. But like all that said, I've used Photoshop. There's a lot of folks who use Fireworks for this. If you don't want to pay for tools like that, there's GIMP, which I think is free. What do you use when you're going hi-fi? Photoshop? Yeah. That seems to be the gold standard. Do you use the Creative Cloud? No? Okay. We just got into that. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is prototypes. So going back to your question, Per, they demonstrate the interaction and flow of an interface. So there's certain things that you can figure out in a wireframe, how you're laying things out on the page, what kind of elements are there, but there's a whole piece that you don't get until you actually see how it flows and you watch people use it. So we built this in Excerpt. It's going to go. Okay. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Excerpt, it gives me on the left here all my pages that I have. And then I can hide it with this little guy so I can see the whole thing. And now what we've got is, the whole page, the whole home page. And then I've got certain sections that are interactive. So I can go through the sign-up process. I think our connection's a little slow. Well, it's going to take a long time. We'll avoid it. Okay, let's see how we go. And I can show what's going to happen with all different kinds of users that might interact with this application. Everything here is dynamic. I can, I can pull down these bars if I want to. Things can be conditional. Anyway, okay. And then I can start, I can show what it feels like to actually interact with the application, search for things, get my search results. So it has this whole new dimension that just a static mock-up doesn't have. I can show what it might feel like to select some items and then do a comparison, all that sort of thing. And what we're using this for today is to test a lot of our assumptions about the interaction design with our target population. So we can show them, and we can even let them interact with it. And we were talking about this at lunch, Jeff and I. I can say to them from the home page, show me how you might search for a coder. And I can see, do they go to the search button? Are they confused? Are they not sure where it is? Are they, how long does it take them to find it? There's two different options. Which one do they go to? So I can really start using it for usability testing, and I can get a lot of ideas about how well my design is holding up when I let people play with it. Pardon me, I'm usually not this challenged. Okay. So somebody mentioned PowerPoint a second ago. You can definitely make click-through prototypes with PowerPoint. You just hyperlink buttons on a page, have somebody go through a whole deck. You can even make a PDF with hotspots. That's like your simplest prototype out there. You can even take OmniGraph or Visio export. You can do it inside the tool sometimes and just make a click through. If you want to do something that's more complex, like showing rollovers and drop-downs and have conditional content, we use Axure, another product called iRise. I haven't used it. It's really expensive. That's why we don't use it. I think Axure is a great value. It's about $289 for the standard version and $5 something for the Pro version. And then if you want to do a truly code-ready prototype where you can show virtually anything that you can code in JavaScript, you can use HTML and CSS in JavaScript. But of course, you have to know how to do that. That's a lot more complicated than learning a tool like Axure, which you could really learn in a day, I think. Okay. So does all of that make sense? Any questions? Okay. Cool. All right. So we talked a little bit about at the beginning about user experience versus visual design, or UX versus UI, and how they're not the same thing. And we get asked that question all the time. Can you just pretty up the interface? Can you just give us a new UI? And so we've spent a lot of time as a company talking about the differences between these two things and how can we communicate this out to the world. And so I wanted to spend a little time talking about visual design and how important it is and how it fits into user experience. And there's a white paper in your packet that I wrote on this topic. But we also did a webinar on it, and these are some slides that we created there. So we get this sometimes. Have you guys ever gotten this request? Beautiful Windows Forms from like 98. Can you reskin this? Can you just make this prettier? So we sometimes get that. But what we have learned, and what we talked about with the cereal versus the turkey sandwich this morning, user experience design is not user experience design. They're not the same thing. User experience design is really the sum total of visual design, interaction design, and user research. They're all important. If you leave one out, your user experience design will be incomplete. So here's a great example. Who knows what this is? Yeah. So this is an example in my mind of something that is very beautiful, but it's not very functional. And the reason I say that, I've been there. I've been inside it. It's a building. You can go in. But it's been over 100 years since the architect who designed this died, and it's still not finished. So the design itself is so complicated that it's still not done. In fact, they're saying they hope it to be done in 2026. So it's kind of a long way, a long time. It's very, very expensive proposition. It is beautiful, though, and I love it. Here's another example of something that is quite well designed, but functionally, I'm not sure. So this is the bear sleeping bag. And I see two main problems with this, and you guys might see more. If you zip it all the way up over here to the far right, it might be a little hard to breathe through those jaws, and they're not very big. And then let's say you're camping with your spouse, and they wake up in the middle of the night a little disoriented. Let's just hope there's not a shotgun in the tent, because you might not make it out alive. So these are just a couple examples of things that have a pretty interface, a pretty look and feel, but aren't really all that functional. And here's the last one. I'm sure you guys get these catalogs from West Elm and Pottery Barn. Everything looks so beautiful, and then you think, could you really live in that room? So this is pretty, but how do the plants stay in the pot, and how on earth do you water them? So I think this is one that was staged for the photo shoot, and they probably took it all down. So what we want to strive for is great interfaces that not only look good, but they perform well and they fulfill a real need. So they're useful and usable and beautiful. I think that's the perfect triangle that we're searching for, those three things. And we can tell from those previous examples that aesthetics alone do not ensure a good product, even though that's a common misconception out there that they do. So I want to talk about a few ways that visual design, really good visual design, can enhance a product. We tend to think of visual design as kind of coming at the end. We do all of our great lo-fi wireframe work, and then we sort of put a UI on it at the very end. But what I want to show you here is that visual design can add a lot to your project if you infuse it a little earlier, in elements of it, not the whole thing. It can increase usability, and it can engage users and build their trust. So how could it increase usability? I'm going to get you guys to help me out here. These are the 4 ways, but I want to talk a little bit about each one. So in terms of increasing usability by clearly explaining a hierarchy to the user, so communicating to them where they are and where they can go and how they can get there. The visual design elements of this interface, and I've given you guys some clues, but who can tell me some examples on here of how visual design is helping with the hierarchy? Hint, it's where the arrows are pointing, but anyone? Want to volunteer one?
Red means trouble is happening.
That's definitely catching your attention. The red is definitely catching your attention. Can you tell where you are?
Yeah,
It's
flow
a different
is-
color.
Yep.
yeah, the flow is left to right.
Yep. Invoices, yep. And can you tell where you can go? Yeah. You can go anywhere on the left. You can go to those different sections. You can go to the tabs up at the top, or you can do an action. The invoice button stands out in a positive way, whereas the overdue stands out in a negative way.
You can sort based on each column header.
Right, yeah. And that's really clear as well. And they're treated even in a, a different color. So visual design can increase usability through legibility. So making it clear what the data is, how you need to read it, and how you need to digest it. So again, do I have any errors there? Well, this one's pretty self-explanatory. There's a lot of data on this page, but the way that it's arranged here, you don't even really need the column headings to know what you're looking at. There's lots of nice white space between columns. The rows have a lot of nice spacing. The font is appropriate. The size, all of those things are increasing the way that I can parse this data in the table. And it's a fairly boring data table, but there's some things here that make it more interesting and also sort of easier to grok and understand. Learnability is another way, letting the user know what to expect. So kind of going back to some of our design principles. So what can you tell about the system here? What can you learn just from the way the system is designed? Anybody?
But it seems to be built for a user that's got a specific task to do. It's a concise task, and there's not a lot of variance. It's like, I need to go here and accomplish that task and then move on.
Yep. And it's clearly telling you at each page like what kind of task you're doing. And then if you could tell what's similar between these two screens, and hint, there's arrows there. So the way I'm editing is the same here. I can edit something and these fields become form fields that I can make changes to. Same way that they appear here. I can also make changes in much the same way. So once I learn how to do it one place, I've learned how to do it everywhere. They're always treating it the same. They're using our design principles. And the last is feedback. So we talked about this. Providing visible, understandable, and actionable feedback about what's happening with the system. So here, again, can you tell what's happening just through the design? This is, you were talking about Michael was talking about good feedback or prompting feedback, not necessarily error feedback, but it's telling me what I could do next. And then here it's telling me no match is found, giving me some options, and it's doing so visually differentiating my error from just another option that I have. So not only can visual design help with usability, but it can also engage users and build their trust, and mainly through consistency with the brand and engaging the user. So I'll show you what I mean by that. We all are this way. When we go to the grocery store or the drugstore, we're picking things off a shelf amongst a myriad of products. We're buying or using things by brands we trust, even if sometimes if they cost more. So this is an example of a site that we built. We built the bottom two pages. The top two pages are a marketing site that our client already had. So when we went to build the application pages, it was really important that we continue to follow the brand. And we make users feel comfortable if they enter here and they sign in, that when they get to the application, which is, they don't need to know this, but a truly separate entity, that they still feel like they're within the same the same brand, they're in the same site, even if they're really not. Because we're using a consistency with the bar, with the logo, with the background header treatment, even though the second half of the page has a white background, it still feels consistent with the brand. So the second way that we build trust is through engagement. You know, a lot of times you'll hear that people say if an application feels beautiful, their perception of its usability is greater, even if it's really not. So I'm contrasting our original Windows Forms screen with an application that we built for a client to give users an idea of a score on a big data set that they enter into the system. And so both of these screens have a lot going on, but you feel a lot more comfortable in the one on the right, even though there's still a lot happening. Information is organized hierarchically. We're using consistent images and colors and placement. There's a clear grid. In other words, it's deceptively simpler to use because it's well designed. What I just want to make sure through this is that we communicate that visual design is still really important and that we should consider it maybe a little earlier than we typically do. So that's what this is about. If we're looking at a timeline for an application design or design methodology, we're spending time doing some of our research and designing tasks, but we're involving interaction design fairly early. There's some things that we can do up front, not necessarily that we're building high fidelity comps right away, but that we might just be exploring different interactions or exploring different icon treatments or just exploring different ways that the visual interface might work. And then we can also do some iterative testing of visual design as we're testing our wireframes. I think that's okay to do. And you're probably going to get a lot more bang for your visual design buck if you're iterating and testing rather than just sort of slapping it on at the end. So I just want to touch really quickly on how do you incorporate visual design into the user experience process. And I think there's sort of 4 tenets. Understanding the brand, making sure that we're doing the right visual design activities at the right time. We're starting some of them early, and we're testing the visual design. Oops. So this is fairly self-explanatory, understanding the brand from the outset. If you can get branding guidelines, if you can understand the personality, the conversational style that a company is trying to have with its users, that's going to have a great deal of influence, not only on your visual design, but also on your wireframes as well. We don't want to create these high fidelity comps too soon because of one of the things that we keep talking about is that people perceive things are done. And also changing some of the fundamental elements of a page, it's a lot easier to do in a black and white wireframe than in a high fidelity comp that someone spent a lot of time being very, very precise with. But at the same time, we can start some of these activities earlier, which is what I just mentioned. Exploring different treatments of a particular element, exploring, I'm thinking about Osler, exploring different ways of visualizing different data. And then it's really important to test the visual design, to provide different options and see what resonates more with users, see what they can understand better. And so this is going to look familiar to you when I get here. So this is, and I asked Andrew's permission on this one. He knows this is here. This is a project that we worked on with McKesson, and we were testing a number of different ways to represent the same data. Believe it or not, this is the same data, just represented a bunch of different ways. And some of the questions that we had were red and green. It's so trite, but is it the only way you can really represent good and bad? Or could you represent it with blue and orange? Turns out people don't get blue and orange like they get red and green. Sorry, Arvin fans.
Sorry about this. I was with a company that used red and green to, and then I can't remember what the middle color was, but you know red was bad, green was
Yeah, maybe yellow or orange
and
in
it
the
was
middle.
a dashboard, and CEO and CFO were colorblind. So in this presentation, they had no idea
Yeah,
we were showing them.
yes. So that's about 10% of males are
We
colorblind.
had to add symbols.
Mhm.
And so, you know, triangle meant
Right.
bad. I don't remember. You know, circle meant good. And I can't remember how star meant good. I'm sorry.
Okay.
And I think a down, like a triangle meant bad. But anyway.
Yeah, an up triangle or a down triangle.
In the next iteration, we had to add symbols because we realized
Mhm.
that with red and green, they do make a lot of sense if you're not colorblind.
Right, right. Well, if you're using red and green, you have to have double encoding. So you have to have color plus a symbol or color plus a location or something else because you're right. And that's so funny that was the two top executives. Yeah, yeah, I bet. Yeah. So the one that we ended up choosing is one that uses red and green encoding, but the placement of them is that double encoding that we have. But it was interesting, we did user interviews and testing of these different scenarios to find out what was more impactful, which ones were easier to tell, you know, where something was in terms of a 0 to 100 or that type of thing. So, and this is another kind of going back to that design thinking, you know, quantity. They were just churning out these ideas because you just never know what's going to resonate. It could have been that, yeah, we love red and green, but let's just say, and it didn't turn out this way, but these pie charts were just super compelling. So it's good to try all these different ways, even though you might think some of them are wrong or ugly or whatever. So just want to recap all of this for you. You know, great interfaces, great user experience design is the sum total of solving a real problem, functioning efficiently and effectively, and being visually engaging. So that interaction design, visual design, and user research are all important. And that visual design is so much more than just pretty pictures. I think a lot of people think that, oh, just make it slick, just make it sexy. That's all we need. But it's so much more than that. And when we can integrate visual design into the user experience design process, overall we are more effective than if we do something that's just a waterfall, wireframes, visual design, and never the two shall meet. Okay? All right. Is that it for me, Erica?
That's it for you.
Okay. We're talking UX trends this afternoon, and so the next trend that we're going to hit is mobile. And we've touched on mobile in our previous workshops. Remember, Erica said at the beginning, we've totally revamped this whole workshop. And every time we did the workshop, the feedback that we heard was more mobile, more mobile. But what I wanted to do, and I hope it doesn't feel pedagogical to you, but I want us to have a good foundation about the difference between native versus web versus hybrid. And if somebody knows all of that and like can get up here and teach it, raise your hand, because I don't want to bore you guys to death. Okay. I'm going to lean on you, though. You're going to have to answer some questions.
I'll just correct you and get smart out.
Okay. That'd be perfect. I love that. And I also want to get into the guts a little bit, even though it's very technical, on responsive design, because I think a lot of people talk about it, but they don't really know what it is or what it involves. And what I'm hoping is when you leave here today, you'll have enough in your back pocket that you can talk really intelligently in a product meeting about mobile. And we were talking this morning, you know, it gets religious real fast with mobile about native versus HTML5, all that sort of thing. And so I think we hit on politics with healthcare.gov, so we're getting on religion this afternoon with mobile. But I wanted to give you a good overview. And then we're going to talk a little bit at the end about designing for touch, which is really truly the UX topic here. But I think it's good to have that foundation. Anyway, I hope you'll agree. And if not, you can throw tomatoes. So as we all know, we've all heard these buzzwords. Not all apps are created equal. We've got native apps, iOS apps, Android apps, Windows, BlackBerry apps. We've got web apps, another name for HTML5. They run on the browser in your phone. And we've got hybrid apps, which are a mixture of the two. So let's talk a little bit about them. So you guys probably know this, but let's just touch on it real quick. The native apps are available via the App Store, whether it's an Apple App Store, the Android Marketplace, all those kinds of places. And they can utilize all of the native features of a device, which is really cool because it's a lot of stuff that you can't do in a traditional desktop or a laptop or web browser. The camera, the GPS, the accelerometer, all those sorts of things, all those inputs, all those things that make mobile really cool, you can use with native apps. If you develop an iOS app, it doesn't run on Android. You have to develop an Android app. You guys probably all knew that. But it can also incorporate gestures, either the native gestures that come with a toolkit for the platform, or you can even sometimes create your own gestures. So you can create an app that has some native content, but also utilizes content delivered through a browser. Walgreens is a good example of this. They have a native iOS app, and you can do a lot of things, like you can take a picture of the barcode on your prescription bottle, and that's all native functionality because it's utilizing your camera. But if you go to the shop portion, It's in a browser, and it's the same shop on iOS, Android, Windows, whatever. They're just pulling the same web browser in. So they're packaging some HTML content and some native content all together, and they typically wrap it with something called, they call them a wrapper. PhoneGap is the one I think that's most common, and it will take HTML content and put it in a format that means you download it from the App Store. It's a native format. Okay, so let me go back for a sec. Web apps, also HTML5 apps, they're available via URL, so you don't get them from the App Store. But you can bookmark them to your Springboard or desktop so that it looks like you're launching an app. And that's what they want you to do, because they don't want you to forget about their app. And HTML5 is always advancing, and there's more and more things you can do with HTML5 that you used to not be able to do. You can use the GPS, you can even remove the browser Chrome so that it looks like it's running natively. You can do basic gestures. There's talk of a camera API, but I'm not sure how mature that is. So one of the questions that we get all the time is, what should I build? A mobile website? We just want to go responsive. It's going to be cheaper. No, we need a great user experience. We need to go native. So the question is, how do you choose? And I think what you have to do, because there's, as you can see, there's not a clear-cut answer, is you have to prioritize what your criteria are specifically for what you're trying to accomplish. Maybe not just you, but your business, but your users as well. So if you need a feature that you can only get through a native app like the camera or the accelerometer or something like that, if your functionality depends on that, like your Instagram, you need the camera, okay, you need to be native because that's how you're going to get it. If you need offline functioning, which is really important a lot of times in healthcare, because we don't want to store data on the phone, and in hospitals, the connectivity is hit or miss. So the physician, the nurse has got to be able to work no matter where they are. We need offline functioning, native. Discoverability, meaning a lot of times if you want to know a great restaurant to go to, you're not going to go to the App Store and try to find an app for that. You're just going to search the web. And then the first restaurant you pull up has a great web mobile experience. You're a lot more discoverable if you're on the web. So as you can see, it's a balancing act. Native apps are faster. They're obviously easier to install. Some people don't understand that whole save the bookmark to the desktop thing, even though that's what they want you to do. But if you want something that you're maintaining one code base and you're independent in terms of what platform you're running on, then HTML, web, or hybrid is more advantageous. And then if you want content restrictions, approval process, and fees, and what I mean by that is not if you want to add those restrictions, but if you want to avoid those restrictions, and the classic example is Playboy, they went web app because they can get around all of the strict rules in the iOS Apple Store. So web is obviously more advantageous there. And I'm going to skip development for a second and say that typical knowledge is that user interface is better native. Okay, so let's also talk about a concept that you might have heard called mobile first. How many of you guys have heard of this concept? Okay, not that many. Okay, I'm surprised. So mobile first is the idea that you design for your smallest form factor, the mobile phone, first, before you design for your iPad or before you design for your desktop. Now, in reality, a lot of us deal with applications that start out on the desktop, and then we have to scale them down. And that's just life, and we have to deal with it. But if you're starting with a brand new application, think about starting with the smallest form factor. And the reason that you might want to do this is because mobile is exploding. I'll give you some stats on that in a minute. Designing for mobile first forces you to focus on, you've got a really small screen and you've got to prioritize. And third, it gives you some capabilities that you might not be thinking about if you think desktop. So all of a sudden, if you can use a camera or an accelerometer or all those things that are location detection that are available on a phone, your possibilities suddenly become greater because you have more capabilities. So let's talk about those three tenets. And not to bore you with stats, but I did just grab these, so they're pretty recent. And some of them that I think are pretty interesting is that in the United States, 25% of users only use a mobile phone. They don't use, or use a mobile device, a phone or a tablet. They don't use a desktop. Now, we were talking about this in the car, and we were guessing that it's young people, like or millennials, and probably older people. I don't know, that's just my guess. Probably those of us in our age group, because we all go to office every day, are using computers as well. But I thought that was really interesting, and I wonder how fast it's grown and how fast it will grow.
How are there more subscribers than our population?
A lot of people have 2 phones. Or like in my house, there's 2 of us. There's 3 cell phones and 2 iPads for 2 people, so we have 5. Yeah.
Where do these stats come from? What is a good source for these stats?
Yes, and you know, I didn't cite it on this slide. I will give you the site that I got these from. It was referred from an article that I was reading about mobile first, and his stats were old, so I went out and got the new ones.
Because one of the limitations is just, what's the demographic breakdown? How would these numbers look if we said, let's restrict to age greater than 50
Right.
or 65?
Yeah.
Hispanics, 55 to 75.
Yeah, and there's a lot of breakdown in the site where I got this, so I'll send it to you. Actually, what we'll do is we'll put it on the page that you'll all get with all the content. The other one that I thought was really interesting was 90% of mobile subscribers have an internet-ready mobile phone. So you were talking about the flip phone guy? He's in the 10%. It's really fascinating. Yeah, I know, they're the Luddites out there. But to me, that's really fascinating. I mean, when you're talking about reaching people on a mobile platform, no longer do you have to say, oh, that's only a portion of our audience, not everybody uses mobile. Of course, it depends on your business and it depends on the context, but that's pretty close to everybody. It's not your jitterbugs. As I said before, mobile forces you to focus because you're dealing with a very small screen. And so what you have to do is figure out what's really critical. What do people really want to accomplish? And you have to get rid of all the extraneous debris. And you really have to question, okay, if I'm going to get rid of this debris, do I add it back in, or is it really just not necessary? And so the last part is that mobile extends your capabilities. So those of us who've been dealing with the web for a long time, we remember HTML1 and HTML2, and that the toolkit is fairly limited. We can do a lot more now than we ever could with CSS and JavaScript, but it's still fairly limited what we can do on the web. And mobile has a much more extensive feature set. We know where people are, we know if they're up or down, we can do things with all 10 of their fingers. We've got the camera, there's even more. We know, are they portrait, are they landscape? We know a lot more about the user on the phone than we do on the desktop. So kind of related to both this topic and what we talked about before with the native web hybrid is this idea of responsive design. How many of you guys have heard of this or said you were going to build a responsive site or responsive app or, okay. So responsive design is the idea that you take the same elements, but you arrange them, you scale them, you position them differently based on the form factor that your user is using. So as you can see, I've got these 2 elements up here, and on the phone they're fairly small. When I get to the tablet, they've expanded. When I get to the desktop, they've actually split and they're side by side. But they're ostensibly the same 2 elements. And the same thing with this yellow. When it's little, it grows even bigger. Stacked, horizontal. And there's 3 essential elements to responsive design. And I apologize if this is going to get, oh, wait, let me show you this first. So this is a real world example. And we're going the other way now. We're going desktop, tablet, phone. But you can kind of see how my navigation has gone from being on the left to being on the top. The picture's changed, which isn't necessarily what I intended, but it's changed size, even though this is really quite a bit bigger than it looks here. And it's changed size a lot here. It's gone a lot smaller. These pictures that are horizontally laid out here are now stacked on the phone. So you can just kind of get an idea of how things are rearranging in the real world. So there's 3 essential elements to responsive design, and this is where it gets a little technical, but I think it's worth understanding what these things are so that when you talk to somebody about it, you can talk intelligently about it. And Pear, you can help me here. So there are flexible grid layout, flexible images, which we just touched on, and these things called media queries, which to me is sort of an unfortunate name. It doesn't, I could think there's got to be better names, but that's what the industry calls it. So the idea of a flexible grid sort of goes back to best practices in graphic design, visual design, and that is laying things out on a grid. Because if you do lay things out on a grid, meaning that I have horizontal lines and I also have vertical lines, that my elements can span 1, 2, 3, or all of my columns in my grid. So I'm just showing you here a 12-column grid and how you can have any different, these are all different ways you can show 2 columns in a 12-column grid. But you can also show, here we're showing a logo and 2 text columns and then a big box. So as you can see, when I have this grid pattern that I can work with, I can do all kinds of different things with how much I'm spanning each column of the grid. And then the second element of a responsive site is flexible images. So what Pear just said a minute ago is very true, that there's all kinds of different resolutions that you're dealing with, and you may have a picture that's the same pixel count on a desktop and on an iPhone, but it will be significantly smaller on the phone. But there's 3 things that you can do with images that means they're flexible. You can scale them up and down. You can crop them and take portions of them off, or you could just hide them all together if you get to a certain point and say, once I get to the phone, just hide this image. I don't want to see it anymore. So I'm going to show you a site. I'm going to show this to you in action. This is not a video. It's just a site. OK. Let's see if I can do this with my limited mouse. So this is the desktop version. Oh. OK. OK. So I'm going to start scaling. And I want you to look at the picture in the middle. Oh, it's kind of hard to see. Can you see that blue box? It's getting smaller. Oops. Smaller as I go over. OK. So it's scaling, right? It gets bigger and smaller. Now I want you to look at that colored bar right under the nav. See, as I scale in, it's cropping. I'm not actually scaling it. I'm just removing bits of it. So that's 2 different ways. I don't have a hide on here, but you can kind of see the difference in what I'm doing with the images, whether I'm scaling them or, oops, hang on, or cropping them. And the third thing, and this is the sort of techie thing, I think we can get through it, is this idea of media queries. So what they are, they're markup that you're putting in your code that serves different style sheets based on the user agent's features, or whether they're on a phone or a tablet, and which one are they on. And what you're doing is selectively serving those style sheets based on the size that they're looking at. Of course, you can use other parameters like orientation or screen resolution or color, but the main one that people are using is the size. Let me see. OK, so when we go back here, what the media queries are doing is telling me, when do I make this transition from this to this? At what point do these things go from boom, boom, boom to boom? And it's quite complex, and I'm sure Pear can weigh in on this. And it's not something that I think any of us will ever code ourselves, except unless you're a developer. But it's good to know how it works. It's good to know how this thing gets put together in case you want to design this type of thing. Because if you do want to design a responsive site, you have to think about, where are those breakpoints? Where do I want 2 elements to push together and quit pushing and go under each other? How do I want things to lay out? And it's pretty much non-trivial. A lot of times I think people say, oh, just make it responsive. That's the silver bullet. That'll solve all our problems. But it's actually quite a significant design effort to really thoughtfully plan how everything is going to look and scale and move and what the experience will look like. Because there's a myriad of phone sizes, not just phone, tablet, web. There's many stages in between. Does that make sense? Responsive? Yeah? Do you feel like you know more about responsive than you did earlier today? Okay, good. Yay, yay. If that's all that happened today, I'm very happy. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about just a little bit, and this is the real UX part, but I just thought that other part was important, is this idea of designing for touch. And this is, I think, a really interesting slide. This assumes you're a righty, so you're holding the phone like this. And where can your thumb go if you're an adult of average size? And so when you're designing, you want to think about, where am I going to put the stuff people are going to use all the time? Well, I definitely want to put it in this easy zone. Where do I want to put things that they're not going to use as much? In the hard, okay, or maybe even if I've got something that they're rarely going to use, let's put it up in difficult. And it's interesting to see how it changes from the iPhone 4 to the iPhone 5. Yes, the iPhone 5 gave us lots more screen real estate, but really all it did was give us this difficult to reach zone. So only a UI designer would think of that, right? And the other thing, sort of going back to what Per was talking about, designing for touch, is this idea that the average finger pad is big. That's why when you take a website and you just scale it down and you've got a list of links, chances of you hitting the one you want the first time without pinching and zooming, it's pretty rare because they're so close together and they're so tiny, and our fingers are clumsy and big. And mine are girl fingers. I mean, if you have bigger fingers, it's even harder to touch things. So Apple says that the touch target should be 44 pixels square. That's what you should be aiming for, because that's the size of the average human finger pad. And that you really shouldn't, you should be at, that's about 9 millimeters. You really shouldn't go any smaller than 7. And you should allow 2 millimeters in between elements so that people don't accidentally touch the wrong thing. So I think a lot of times in mobile design we forget that that's important, and that people's fingers are kind of clumsy. They're not the fine mouse pointers that we're used to. I'm sort of glossing over a lot of this stuff, but I want to make sure that you guys understand the importance of thinking about your phone interface different than you think about your tablet interface. The tablet interface is typically going to be a lot bigger unless you're using one of those little, what are the Google, what are they called?
Nexus 7?
Yeah, the Nexus 7, yep. But that you want to be careful that when you go from phone to pad or phone to tablet, you're not just cramming a bunch of extra interface junk in there because you can. You can certainly put more on the screen, you've got more real estate, but you want to think about designing for clarity over density, as Josh Clark says there. But that they're different. They're not, it's not just the same design blown up. It's not throwing a bunch of extra junk in there. It's being pretty judicious and thoughtful about what you add in when you do a tablet interface design. And then I just want to show you this because I think it's pretty different. We looked at the thumb targets on the phone, but the tablet, they hold it totally different. Some people hold it down here, very small thumb target area, but a lot of people hold it in one hand and tap with the other, or hold it in two hands and then tap with one hand. So it's more than we can get into today, but I think the use cases for tablet is a lot of times different than the use cases for phone. What people are willing to do on a tablet is different than what they're willing to do on a phone. And one thing I think we've seen a lot of is that the mobile sort of design patterns are really bleeding into web. So I think the trend we'll see is more norming over mobile and web, but the push will be from the mobile side. We'll see a lot more mobile interface elements appearing in desktop websites. And I'm sure we've all done it. I mean, you even take an analog thing like a page, a printed page, and you try to pinch and zoom. I mean, we're just all getting programmed that way. So it's more and more. So just the last thing is, so how do you design for all this? The $64,000 question is, okay, I've got all this information, now what do I do with it? Well, I think it requires a lot of thought about your needs, about your audience, before you choose a platform, before you choose an approach, because it's not easy. I mean, as you can see here, it's just not easy. And then I would advocate working very closely with development because, as you saw in that chart, there's question marks on cost. And development's going to be able to tell you, yes, hybrid sounds better for this, but it's going to cost us extra to do it because of this. You know, there's just a lot of moving parts here. And when you're thinking about designing for responsive, it seems like there's a lot of design that you have to do. You have to design what it looks like on the mobile. You have to design what it looks like on the tablet and the desktop. It triples your design overhead. And there's a school of thought out there that says you do your wireframes in mobile first. Think about all your layout, all your features, all your priorities, and you wireframe in mobile. Then you do your visual design in desktop. So you have bookends. But each design resource is only doing one set of designs. And then you work closely with your development team to bridge the gap, to figure out what does it look like in the middle. It's not perfect, but it's one way to sort of get around that. And then the last thing is iterating and testing. It looks one way on a wireframe. It might look different when you actually get it on the phone and you start seeing how it's working. And all of a sudden, you don't want to scroll all the way to the bottom for that piece of content. You want it to come in at the top. Any questions? Nope. All right, I'm going to hand it to you, Scott.